coming in. There we go. Perfect. All right. Welcome everyone and happy Wednesday. Oh, hold on one second. Sorry, I messed up my sound. Okay. Hopefully that will work. Are you all hearing me okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right, perfect. Welcome everyone. We are starting off our fifth session of our Road to Recovery Species Working Group Forum focused on the recovery wheel. So we are on part 5 of our 6-part series. So today we'll be focusing on the Strategize recovery section of the wheel. Next week, when we reconvene in July, we'll finish off the last section of the wheel, which is the implement action section. So we are coming to the end of our recovery wheel tutorial, and we hope to continue the Species Working Group Forum moving forward to focus on other topics that will, of course, be embedded within the recovery wheel and ones that species working groups will hopefully benefit from an open space to discuss and learn from each other. So you can be expecting some communication from Road to Recovery in the future to gather your input on kind of how this forum space moves forward. But we hope you'll continue to join us in this session to make best use of the opportunity to connect with R2R, but more importantly, with other species working groups working to solve similar problems. So welcome. We have simultaneous translation available for today's session. So to enable the translation in your Zoom controls, you'll see a globe icon. You can click on the globe icon and select the language that you would like to listen to the session in, either English or Spanish. Recordings will also be available in both languages on the Road to Recovery website. So for today, like I said, our goal is to dive into part 5 of the recovery wheel. And this is the 5th session in this 6-part series that will bring us all the way around back to the beginning of the wheel. And I've mentioned this in previous sessions, but as a refresher, or if you are new to the recovery wheel when viewing this session, we have the wheel broken up into 6 action categories. Within each action category, there are 3 different segments, and each of those 3 segments has specific criteria, 5 each, guiding working groups through accomplishments within that category. So that gives us a total of 90 criteria as we work our way around the wheel. And that's a lot to handle and a lot to think about, which is why we've broken it into these 6 sessions to really dive into all of those criteria. So on the Road to Recovery website, there's a downloadable version of the recovery wheel. It downloads into an Excel spreadsheet, which includes all of those 90 criteria. It begins at the top with the organized network section, and then works its way counterclockwise around the wheel. So here you'll see those 6 action categories that I mentioned. Within each, there are 3 segments, and then within each of those segments, you'll see 5 screen here. You'll see 5 numbers going from the center of the circle towards the outside. The wheel is designed, in theory, to work clockwise from top all the way back to top, and then from the middle of that circle towards the outside. We acknowledge that that doesn't always happen in practice. There are many instances where working groups may complete kind of the 3rd criteria in a section before completing 1 and 2. That's something that as the Road to Recovery review wheels from different working groups, something that we look at to inform kind of how we guide and advise groups in using this tool and how we might be able to refine it to fit best with the logical path that working groups take as they work towards species recovery. So when you download the Excel spreadsheet from the R2R website, this is just a screenshot of what it looks like. And then you have space here in this column where you see the 2s and 1s. to score for the species that you are focused on. From a 0, meaning no progress has been made in this particular area, a 1, meaning some progress has been made, and a 2, that this is an area that the working group feels has been accomplished. We also give the option of a 9 with the recognition that not all of these 90 criteria might apply specifically to every species or at a specific time that a working group is using the wheel. So that 9 kind of is a not applicable number. You might use that at different times. We hope that the wheel can be a tool that working groups can use in grant writing, in tracking progress from specific funding sources, et cetera. And so that may be an example of an application of this tool where that 9 might be useful if it's a criteria that's just not covered in a particular grant that the group is applying for and you're reporting progress or something like that. We also acknowledge that the barrier, the cutoffs between some progress and accomplished might differ from group to group. And so those are conversations that are really useful for us at Road to Recovery to hear your reflections on as you work through and use this tool at the species working group level. So for today, we are over here, this yellow box, Strategize Recovery. So we started, gosh, I can't do my months backwards. We started 4 months ago with Organized Network, and we've worked our way all the way around now to Strategize Recovery, which is an exciting section. We started with team formation and getting a working group up and running. We moved through kind of the gathering of information about a species, about landscapes, about partnerships. We started to assess that information and what it will mean for the species. We started looking at as many different data sources as possible. Now we bring all of that information that exists related to a species and the efforts that we've made in terms of partnership building and group development, and we start to begin to make actual plans for action, for implementation, and for conservation delivery, which is where we move as we get through these final 2 sections of the wheel. And it's important to note, and I think I've noted in previous sessions, that the wheel is not meant to be a one-off. You start at the top, you end at the top, and you're done. It's meant to be iterative. It's we acknowledge at Road to Recovery and across the bird conservation community that recovery work and action, implementation of conservation strategies, these things cannot wait for many tipping point species. We have to build upon what we know. We have to start conservation action, and then as we learn more, we adapt. And the wheel is designed to work in that adaptive conservation context. And so, though we will quote unquote end at the top, we do hope that this is a tool that working groups use and return to periodically to update and also to guide kind of action and paths towards species recovery. So just as a refresher of where we're getting to based on last session. So in action category 4, which was the last one that we did, that focused on identify challenges. We talked about habitat and ecology. We talked about landscape level challenges, and then we talked specifically about limiting factors, about hypothesizing about regarding those limiting factors, and then trying to increase confidence through our work as to what those limiting factors are and specifically where and how they're important for species populations. So now we take those categories, and like I said, we're moving towards actually planning for recovery efforts and conservation action. So we morph into, rather than thinking about challenges and identifying these problems, we're now thinking about opportunities for addressing these challenges, and we're thinking of strategies for mitigating limiting factors. Section 5, action category 5 also includes partnerships and funding, which I know is a topic at the forefront of all species working groups' minds and ours at Road to Recovery all the time, but especially now with so many changes to funding opportunities that are available for conservation. So that's where we're going with action category 5. Please jump in anytime you have comments or examples from the work that you've been doing specifically with your species working group or with other recovery efforts. Because those examples are always really helpful for people to add context to these types of recommendations. So we are here and we will jump right in. So like I said, we're thinking now in this section about opportunities and mitigation. So we're starting with landscape level opportunities, and these are opportunities for recovery. So what you see here, these numbers indicate where we are on the recovery wheel. I realize now 5 sections in, I should have had a little wheel picture always up in the corner for reference for everyone. But we're in action category 5. This is segment 1, which is landscape opportunities, and then the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here are the criteria that work from the inside of the wheel towards the outside. So number 1, prioritize alignment with broad scale threat reduction campaigns would be the piece of the wheel that's closest to the center for this segment. So back in section 4, we did a partner analysis. So we looked at all potential partners. We looked at partner organizations that may have overlapping priorities with those that are required for this particular species conservation. And we think about how we can prioritize existing efforts that are most compatible with the goals that the working group has identified are needed for this species. Number 2, identify compatible allied partnership goals and objectives. So we started this section, this explanation was listen carefully, understand the goals and objectives, because I think listening first is always so important in building partnerships or coming to potential partners and asking for anything, right? Even if it's just time to collaborate or sharing ideas in work, listening first to what that organization's priorities are, and then really focusing on mutual benefits. So rather than asking, thinking about what capacity, what skills, what expertise exists within the working group that could be beneficial for that partner, and vice versa, so that we're proposing and working towards mutually beneficial partnerships and collaborations. Number 3 here, identify beneficial practices for working with outside partners. So there are a lot, I mean, there are books, right? There are fields of research that deal with relationship building, partnership building, collaborative initiatives broadly, right? Not only in the field of conservation. Certainly, there's a lot of existing work and best practices and guidance in this area to think about when approaching partners and when trying to align goals. And so this is an area, and I think I mentioned last time, um, one of our goals with the wheel tool next, now that it's developed and being used, is to try to create kind of companion toolboxes for these action categories that would bring together a lot of resources, excuse me, specific to the criteria included in these different segments. And this is one that I have started working on pulling together lists of best practices for engaging with outside partners. As many of you know, the bird conservation world is developing kind of best practices for working group collaborations, and that will get at some of this a little bit. But this is a little different in terms of looking at what best practices and what expertise exists for these coordination and alignment of goals with outside partners. So that is coming and being compiled from on the Road to Recovery side. Number 4, develop strategies for aligning bird objectives with allies. So looking at programs that already exist that most closely align with specific objectives. So we have some examples here, but what are priorities of local conservation organizations within the focus areas that the species working group has identified in previous sections of the wheel that most coordinate and most align with the needs of the species. So last time, actually, I think it was in section 3, we worked through kind of the relationship between these broad regional perspectives, limiting to more specific focus areas, and then even more specific limiting factors within those focus areas. Um, now is the time to look at those and then look at how do they cross over to other organizations and how do they align with other priorities. And as a social scientist who interacts frequently with many of the species working groups, one of the questions that I often get from groups is how do we get this organization, how do we get this group of people to care about this specific bird or this specific conservation goal? And my answer is usually, do they need to care? And how do we figure that out, right? So we want everyone to care about these specific bird species and the reasons that they're declining, right? We want commitment and excitement and energy and love for these species and a true intrinsic dedication, right, to saving them. And when we can get that, that's wonderful, but we can't always. And so my answer to that question is always kind of nuanced in figuring out, okay, yes, I think efforts in increasing awareness and care, right, of the plight of these species is important. Conservation action is also important. So if it's not birds that motivate a group or motivate specific people, what is it? Because something is a motivator. So how do we identify what is the motivator for this potential partner organization or the communities that they engage? And then how do we align our goals focused on this specific bird species with those motivations? How do those motivations how can they be used to help this bird species? And so that's what we're really getting at here. Another place where we're putting in some effort to give some more guidance and examples on what that looks like. But there are many working groups who are doing that well already, finding partner organizations that are engaged with programs that do overlap with needs of the species, and then being able to adapt messaging to really align with the goals. And then number five here would be once you've kind of worked through all of this as a working group, having being intentional about how the working group is putting energy into maintaining this work with partners and exploring these opportunities with partners is really important. So we recommend having a subcommittee that's established that really focuses on partner opportunities. And that's a group of people that are constantly maintaining partner relationships and also looking for opportunities to engage with new partners, again in ways that are mutually beneficial and being cognizant of the goals that exist for those particular partners. So with the fourth one that I mentioned, Kat, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Steve had a question, I think, in regards to
Oh,
5.1.3. Could you please provide an example or two of these practices?
yes, sure. So, and I think some of these would probably go back to when we're initially and I don't have the numbers for the other sections right in front of me. Um, going back to when you first are identifying the partners, but there's certainly I think this particular 5.1.3 is an opportunity to really pull together and coordinate within the working group around these areas. So some of them, and with NABC, I should have had it linked in here. When I send out my follow-up email, I will link a document that does have just, what we put together with the NABC subcommittee as a summary of some of these strategies. But it's engagement in starting in a giving of energy format rather than taking. So looking at organizations and where do those organizations have capacity needs that someone within the working group could fill. So is it an organization that has a subcommittee focused on working lands conservation or that's focused on a particular threat that's relevant to the bird species? And if so, can someone from the species working group volunteer their time sitting on that subcommittee? Can you form those kind of intentional overlaps with partner goals in providing some sort of capacity? Another would be to begin by asking for invitations or an opportunity to sit in on organizational meetings from those partner groups. So rather than having a first initial contact be, we want to work in this specific area because we're focused on this specific bird. Can we partner with you? The first initial ask being, we're really interested in the work that you're doing. Would you mind if someone from our team sat in on this upcoming meeting to learn more about what your group is doing? And in that initial meeting, in those initial engagements, holding off on any asks, right? Being a participating member, contributing to ideas without any initial take. And that time investment can be significant, but I think this is why sort of jumping ahead to the subcommittee piece, having people within the species working group dedicated to focusing on these types of partnership building exercises can help to spread that work amongst the working group, and not have it fall on just the chair, the coordinator, something like that, to lead those efforts and find those opportunities because they have to be maintained. It's not a one-off effort. It's more time being invested and then consistent in engagement to have those mutually beneficial relationships. And I will, like I said, follow up putting together some of those, links to those best practices that could be available in a toolkit that accompanies the wheel. But there are some that exist already that I'd be happy to send out to everyone in a follow-up email. Other questions or comments on these sections? So the slide I have next here, this is coming from a project that the NABC Human Dimension Subcommittee has envisioned for a while. And it's still certainly in outline form, but if I go back here, um, 512 is to align with partner goals. And I think that's one that it can seem abstract. And so what the NABC Human Dimension Subcommittee has envisioned, in which we hope to see move forward in the future, is kind of a companion document that I don't know, it would have a better title, but if the message is not birds, what is it, right? If partner groups that are identified, if birds are not the priority, or if your specific bird of interest is not the priority, what are those potential priorities? Just to prep mindsets and to have within the working group, I think we're going to be most successful if we're ready for what these other priorities might be. And if we have messages and goals for communication of these bird species needs in alignment with these other priorities, ready. Those are already thought out. The connections are already drawn. So this is just an example. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, just examples of what some of these things may be. Are there organizations that focus on water access? I know in one of our social science engagement sessions through Road to Recovery, we had someone from Playa Lakes joint venture talking about just the importance of water access to communities that the joint venture is working to engage, and how messaging has shifted to focus solely on water. The benefits of those conservation goals and actions cross to birds, to the bird species that are of most need. But the messaging to engage communities has to include these water issues. Certainly economic benefit. We know that we need conservation on private lands and specifically ag lands. So how do ag practices provide economic benefit and benefit wildlife species? Lots of research there, but we know that bird species need very specific changes. And so being able to incorporate those specific recommendations, making sure that those are included in guidelines for compliance with CRP or EQIP or whatever the program may be. Um, Protected area management plans, right? Are the species being included in those? Guidelines for working forest management. I'm involved with projects currently in forests in both the northeastern US and the southeast, with some pine making sure that guidelines that that foresters are providing are taking into account the specific needs that we're talking about. So these are challenging, I think, and I could see a lot of benefit in having a document that gives examples of aligning bird priorities with these different other priorities that exist with a lot of partners that species working groups may need to engage in. And so that's something that's being worked on in the human dimensions space between Road to Recovery and NABC. And then with partnership engagement too, this will be another link that I can include in a follow-up. This is just a screenshot from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service stakeholder engagement wayfinder tool, I think is the full name. And so I'll link it there. When you look at this live on the website, all of these are clickable and there's a lot of resources for just engagement with partners. They still use the word stakeholder, which I recommend trying to move away from. Um, but this is a federal government page, and I think changes are slow to say the least, right? But it is a really valuable tool, and there's a lot of great information within these categories that working groups, if there was a subcommittee dedicated to partnership, this would be a place that I would recommend that group start by clicking through and exploring the resources that are available on this page. So that link will be included in the follow-up that I send. Any questions or comments, other examples for the landscape opportunities section before we move on to limiting factors? My son has croup right now, and I thought I had avoided it, but it's not feeling like it right now. Maybe it's catching me. Okay, so the second segment within the Strategize Recovery action category is limiting factor mitigation. So in action category 4, which was identify challenges, we really dove into identifying limiting factors and moving within that section from having a hypothesis about what limiting factors may be to moving towards actually identifying and feeling confident that we have, with strong enough certainty, identify the limiting factor to move forward with conservation action. And that's a piece that I think is a really interesting component to hear more from species working groups about how you all are finding that level of confidence. And, at what level are you comfortable moving forward into recovery? Because I think we all agree we can't wait too long. We can't exist in the research phase for too long without moving towards action and implementation. But then at the same time, we need information to guide implementation. So there's a balance between these, and in thinking of an adaptive conservation approach and framework, there would be a lot of back and forth between these, right? We start to work towards mitigation, and we're learning more that refines what specifically we're targeting, and we adapt as needed. So the first part here, the first criteria kind of goes along with that same train of thought, which is to establish population goals and objectives. And I know this has come up a lot of times with Road to Recovery, and we've been asked at different times to define a threshold for recovery. When we say recovery of species, what is that? And I think that species working groups are working towards being able to define that for the species that you're working with. Some of you have. But at what point, either thinking of population numbers or trends, we say here ideally both, and then thinking about range-wide recovery thresholds as well as within specific focus areas. That's a big task there in criteria number 1. But a really important one is to have a goal that you're reaching for. And so I think that might be a great topic for future discussions with species working groups in understanding, looking at the data, how are groups doing that, and how is it working in defining what recovery will look like for the species. Number 2, develop influence diagrams and results chains to address limiting factors. So these are coming, these next couple criteria come with the basis of using conservation standards Groups don't have to use that framework. And within Road to Recovery, we've discussed how closely to align all of this with the conservation standards approach. I think for any of us who have been in conservation work for any significant period of time, or maybe insignificant as well, we've certainly all been in workshops with post-it notes and conservation standards and looking at threats, looking at actions, setting goals, mapping all of that out. Um, I see a lot of benefit in doing that, and I also see so much variation in how all of those can look that groups can get stuck in that phase. And so we recommend here really having a specific approach targeted towards the limiting factors that were identified in section 4 and diagramming a chain of events that includes threats, includes actions, barriers, issues that would ultimately lead to the reduction and eventual elimination of that limiting factor for the species. Number 3 here goes right along with this, and it's as you do this, as you work through these chains of events, that we're also thinking of human well-being objectives when and where those are relevant for local communities. How are the threats to the species? I think it's easy to see ties from almost any threats back to people. So how are those threats also impacting people? And are we thinking about the human well-being side of those when we're thinking about mitigation strategies? Ideally, we have threat mitigation strategies that don't harm human well-being, whether that's economic opportunity, health, access to resources, that we're trying to make sure that in eliminating the threat for a species, we're not increasing burden to local communities. Number 4, determine sequential stages, progress, metrics, research, and monitoring plan. So a lot packed in to number 4. But this is where the adaptive piece comes in, right? So we've mapped out, we feel confident we've identified a limiting factor. We feel confident we've mapped out a chain of events that would lead to that limiting factor being lessened or eliminated for the species. And then we've thought through how we'll monitor that. Where are the progress points? Where are the places for data collection? What are those metrics? I highly recommend including human metrics in there as well. And I often advocate for this by reminding people that sometimes biological results take a lot longer to gather and assess than results observations from people. And so trying to incorporate and align those human targets, those can be monitored as well. And sometimes that data is quicker to get back and provide kind of interim monitoring opportunities. And then number 5 here, estimate costs required to reach limiting factor mitigation. So if you recall, where we're headed here is partnerships and funding, which is something we always come back to in any conservation planning. So when we're thinking here, how can we be specific in estimating what's going to be required to focus on this chain of events related to this specific limiting factor, and then we'll move towards thinking about where that funding can come from. If you're not familiar with the Conservation Standards website, I mean, to say it's a wealth of information is an understatement. There's so much there. But this is a link to, I just screenshotted this screenshot. I took a screenshot of this. I'll send this link in the follow-up as well. This is a PDF that's specifically on building results chains. It's very straightforward. It's only 3 pages, and it would be a great just way to wrap your head around creating a diagram for this specific. And again, like I said, it's easy to get sucked into these post-it note structures, right, that end up taking up an entire wall. Conservation is complex. And here we want to remain as targeted and focused on limiting factors for tipping point species and for your particular tipping point species as possible here. Ultimately, I think in doing this and having records of these for species working groups, we could coordinate on where there are shared threats across species and looking at, results chains and action suggestions, paths towards those threat mitigation strategies between species working groups when species are being impacted by shared threats. This is another tool that I pulled up recently in talking to some partners that I wanted to point out. This is also, I'll include the link. This is a conservation standards interactive map that shows case studies. And I think I pulled this up in a conversation that was in response to starting from scratch in identifying partners in a portion of the species range where maybe the working group just doesn't have connections. And so my recommendations there were to use Road to Recovery as a resource. So we have myself, we have Kat, we have a wealth of information in Esmeralda, who is our international fellow, in looking for partnership opportunities and connecting with groups that could have potentially aligned goals. But this is another interesting tool. You can see how many case studies exist here, and any of those are clickable. Most of them have contact information for the organizations in those areas. So as initial places to reach out and to start that learning, right, and listening phase, this is a great tool to explore as a working group. Any questions? Let me pop back to this one. Questions, comments, examples within this limiting factor mitigation section? There's a lot of work packed into these 5 criteria, right? So we summarize, and I think that's something that we really wrestled with, I think, in the development of the wheel, because visually all of the criteria appear to be equally weighted in terms of just where they are on the wheel and how much space they take. Um, some of these take a significant amount of time to move from a 0 to a 1 or from a 1 to a 2 for a working group. And I think some of these would fall into that category. I also hope that as groups work through kind of sections 2, 3, and 4, um, if this limiting factor mitigation section was really explored and agreed upon the approach that a working group might use here early, then as they're working through collecting all the data and figuring out the pieces of the puzzle that are needed to mitigate a limiting factor, you're really putting in a lot of the work of these 5 criteria as you move through those other sections. So we're really building, I think in the last session, really talked about how sessions 2 and 3 were really building up to being able to identify limiting factors and specific focus areas. And then that continues here. And that's, part of the reason the wheel moves around in this particular way. Hopefully all the work and time investment in those earlier action categories contributes significantly to then being able to come together pretty smoothly in organizing. So again, this action category is strategy, right? Strategize recovery. So this is the space where we're really making a plan and organizing all of the information and goals and partnerships that we have as a species working group so that, spoiler alert, we're able to implement in section 6. All right. So our third segment for Strategize Recovery is exploring partnerships and funding. And funding is always a need. So whenever we ask working groups what the barriers are, funding comes up. So I think this section we've landed on calling it partnerships and funding because I think those things really go hand in hand. The stronger the partnerships, the more successful and the more opportunities that may arise for funding for working groups. So for the first one here, full annual cycle conservation plan is completed. So I know working groups have plans in place in a variety of different formats. And so those would be things that would be great to be able to share in a future forum session is how these plans come together. and where the information that's included in them is coming from. But we recommend that they include reviews of biology and human dimensions as profiled in the previous sections of the recovery wheel. Threats. So there's a section where we really identify and focus on threats, limiting factors. In the previous section, we've worked on research and monitoring plans, and developing strategies to mitigate limiting factors. So all of that's coming in together to complete a full annual cycle conservation plan for the species. You recommend that as a first step in this partnership and funding category, so that it can be used and referenced so that that plan can be an outline of where funding is needed, and be part of the process of tracking recovery as funding and as funding it becomes available and then is received by the species working group. Number two is a full annual cycle conservation investment plan completed. So these plans include all of the pieces that the full annual cycle conservation plan would include, but add in cost of investment for recovery phases. And this is timely because we had a meeting with the combined international subcommittees of R2R and NABC just this week, where we heard an update on an effort to bring a lot of conservation investment strategies and plans together related to bird conservation so that those would be accessible across groups. And so I think that would be something that would be really beneficial for species working groups to be able to see those investment strategies that already exist, as models, or perhaps ones that like your own plans can be integrated into. So we'll keep you posted as that progresses. Number three, funding source and partnership analysis completed. So the working group will examine what agencies, policies, programs, what are the potential sources of funding. And this is something as well that I know Road to Recovery has an interest in helping to compile some of these lists of recurring funding opportunities and what their requirements are. But the group, I think every working group, depending on the partnerships that are available, will have a unique list of what the options are for funding. And I think another piece that we all know, many funding opportunities require matches that can be in different forms, whether monetary or in-kind matches. And so those are conversations to have with partners as well early on, before pursuing funding, so which type of match requirements might be able to be met. This can be a daunting category, I think, and I wish it was easier for us at Road to Recovery to give specific, here, apply for these. But we have had success in specific conversations with working groups in brainstorming opportunities and collaborating on grant proposals, providing support and editing and strengthening those. So that's something that, as your working group gets to that point, even just brainstorming meetings with our team at Road to Recovery, we're always happy to participate in those. Number four, strategy to contact and court funding sources. So having a strategy in mind that is used. Ideally, there's someone in the working group who has some experience and success in securing funding. If not, those people exist within the species working group network and within the bird conservation network. And so connecting with people who have seen success in that area would be an initial recommendation, and then working together so that efforts to reach out to potential funding sources aren't happening on a whim, that they're very intentional and targeted, and the materials, the communication, the messaging is all developed in advance very strategically for those particular funding sources, to optimize likelihood of success and response from those. And then number five here is that some sort of funding is secured to proceed with the conservation plan and to implementing the plan because that will move you forward into section six. Questions here or examples of funding success or strategies that working groups have used. And I know this is a time, just given all of the changes to funding structures, federal partners have always been a huge support of bird conservation and a huge funder of bird conservation across migratory ranges. And that has been significantly impacted. And many of you saw the survey that Road to Recovery and the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Group put out that really quantifies that impact. And we're working on getting those results in a shareable format soon. But we can certainly already see that the impact here has been significant. So not only are groups having to likely face the challenge of securing new funding, but we've heard from a lot of international partners that funding that had been promised, like a reimbursable format, is not being received. And so not only is new funding needed, but funding for partners, they may need funding to even get back up to, zero at this stage, given grants that have been terminated before reimbursement and things like that. So this is a an area that's huge challenge, and I think coming together as a Road to Recovery community to share resources of funding opportunities now is a good time for us to probably put some energy into doing that, and perhaps a topic for an upcoming forum as we wrap up the focus on the recovery wheel sections. Other comments, questions, or thoughts on funding? All right, that wraps up our fifth section. So where we're heading next, which will be our July session of the Recovery Wheel Forum, is action category six, which is implement action. This focuses really on adaptive research, on ecosystem change, and then the entire wheel structure of all the 90 criteria. The final one is sustainability. So we know, excuse me, we know that um, recovery is not going to be something that's achieved and then we back away from for most, if not all, of these species. So we hope to meet recovery goals and then move into a management mindset to sustain the levels these species need to thrive and to eliminate, the immediate risks that so many of them are facing now. So that is how we wrap up the entire wheel. And as I've mentioned many times, it doesn't end there. It is iterative, and that adaptive research piece will really capture that and allow us to talk about how to how to approach its use moving forward. So as you and your working groups complete the wheels, and I'll mention this again in the July session and then put out a call for completed wheels, we would love to see them. I like to remind everyone the wheel tool is in no way an assessment of a species working group. It is a way to gauge where a bird species is on its path to recovery, and it allows us at Road to Recovery to really target support and connections that we can provide for working groups to help move along that path. We are also constantly seeking to improve this tool and welcome your feedback on any of the components. And finally, our team is very interested in joining your working group sessions as you work on the wheel. All of the ones that I have been in to date have been incredibly useful to me. I hope that I can provide some insights where useful, but really hearing the conversation that the working group is having around these pieces really sparks so many ideas for us at Road to Recovery on how we can be targeting our support and where we can provide needed capacity to working groups. So keep that in mind and please keep us posted as your groups are working on this tool. We'd love to join and are happy to support as useful. All right. Thank you, everyone. Great to see you. Our recordings will be posted on the Road to Recovery website, and we will hope to see you back in July for action category 6.